know you're not alone.
This is my mom.
'Cause I'm gonna make this place
And this is my mom.
And this is my dad.
Where did our family come from?
Our family came from Russia, Romania, and Lithuania.
How do you know that?
I was very close with my grandparents, and they told me all about their beginnings, where they came from, and who they were. And they actually came before the First World War. They came probably around 1905 to 1910. Jewish people were being persecuted in Europe at that time, and so they came to Canada. They left there because Jews were being persecuted in the pogroms in Russia, and went off to Canada.
How far can we trace back our family?
We can trace 5 generations back in our family, starting with my parents and going all the way back to your great-great-great-grandparents. On my mother's side, we can trace back all the way to your great-great-great-grandmother, who came from Romania with her sons and daughters. Again, they came because of persecution. And my grandfather, who is your great-great-grandfather, was born around 1895. And came to Canada, met your great-great-grandmother, who was from Lithuania. And she was born in about 1900. My grandparents were married in about 1918, had 5 children, my mother being the eldest. She was born in 1920. And there were 4 daughters and 1 son, and each of them had children. And all of them live in Canada, except for a few cousins who moved to the United States, and your grandfather and I, who moved to the United States years ago. On my father's side, my grandmother and grandfather also came to Canada just around the same time in the beginning of the 20th century. That was about 1900 also, when they were about 17 years old. They came and had also 5 children. They had 4 boys and a daughter. And my father was their eldest child. His name was Fred, and they had my brother and myself, my brother being the oldest.
So how old were my family members when they were coming here from Russia?
Your great-great-grandparents were between 2 and 17 years old when they came from Russia, came with their parents for a new life in Canada.
That must have been really difficult to start a whole new life in Canada.
Not as difficult as staying in Russia, Romania, or Lithuania, where they were being persecuted and killed. Jewish men at the time had to go into the Russian army and be in the Russian army for like 20 years, 25 years. So they were escaping that, and they were coming with their children to give them a better life. And they did make a better life in Canada.
I know that you and Zadie left Canada when my mom and uncle were little to come move to America and live in Florida. Can you explain why you actually ended up leaving Quebec?
Yes, absolutely. Very similar situation to my great-grandparents. In that Quebec was going through a situation where Quebec wanted to separate from the rest of Canada, and we didn't want to stay there. So we decided we had to give our family a better life, and we ended up coming to Florida. And it actually was a good decision.
So do we have any veterans in our family?
Yes, we do. We have quite a few of my uncles who fought in the Second World War, and they were veterans of the Canadian Army.
Did they go to Europe to fight?
Yes, they did go to Europe to fight, and thank goodness they all came back safe.
Do we have genealogical records of our family?
We don't have any. First of all, a lot of our relatives really weren't even sure of what year they were born in, because records weren't kept that closely then. And also because of the Second World War, a lot of the records for the Jewish people were destroyed, and so really we can't find any records. We only have records of our parents' marriages and their parents' marriages, but that's about it.
So where did your family come from?
Well, it was assumed for very many years that my father was born in Poland, because when he came to Canada in 1921, he had Polish papers. I learned several years ago from a Holocaust survivor that my father was actually born in Russia and didn't become Poland till approximately 1919 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The border would change. My father told me the border would change as a youth. One day it would be Russia, one day it would be Germany, one day it would be Poland. So I think his actual place of birth though was Russia. My mother was born in Canada in 1919. Her parents came from Russia.
So your mother was already living in Canada, and then your father came from Russia in what year?
1921. My mother was born in Canada in 1919. My father came in 1921. At the age of 16, my mother met my father, who was 31 years old at the time. He was 14 years older than her. He had met her because his brother was dating my mother's sister. That's how we met my mom, and they got married. She was 17 years old when they got married. And at 18 years old, in 1938, my brother was born. He did not give us any information on the stories of his youth in Russia. He would never talk about it. It was only as he was close to dying that he gave us insights to what life was and the problems. His father was murdered in the pogrom in 1907, and his mother brought up 4 girls and 2 boys all by herself. And she came to Canada with my father in 1921 and one of the daughters. She didn't have a penny. She came on the Magentic, which was part of the White Star Lines, the same company that owned the Titanic.
Hold on to me as we go, as we roll down.
Do we have veterans in your side of the family?
My father's first cousin, he enlisted in the RAF, the Royal Air Force, before Canada was actually involved in World War II. He joined the Royal Air Force. He flew 26 missions over Germany.
So Bubby told me that you left Quebec because they were trying to separate from Canada. When did you come to the United States?
We moved here in 1979. The realization that I was a second-class citizen in Canada, like my father. And then when my children were born, I realized they would be second-class citizens, and I didn't feel that we're ever going to gain full recognition. Whereas in the United States, by the second generation, you're considered an American. The political situation in Canada, Quebec at the time, was quite unnerving. It was a nationalistic movement that drew parallels to what happened in Europe preceding World War I, after preceding World War II, where whenever a nationalistic movement takes foot, the first groups to be persecuted are generally the Jews. As a young man, I didn't believe that it was possible to happen, but people who had lived through the wars, lived through the persecutions, would question me and ask me, how can you be sure that it won't happen again? I first felt that the United States was a much more democratic country, and I chose to make the move. Even though we sacrificed a lot, we left a lot of family in Canada, and my children grew up without their cousins. I still feel that we made the best choice. It was a hard choice, but we made the choice given what was going on at the time.